Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and the top stories today are essentially President Trump has approved Canada-US pipeline expansion. This is very big news for Canada. It will boost Canada's oil exports by 12%. And Canada has received a big warning from China, a red line from China when it comes to Taiwan. I'll tell you what that's all about when it comes to Taiwan visits and warships. And the Iran proposal to the United States may open doors for talks. The latest update on the U.S.-Israel-Iran war that's been at a ceasefire since April 7th, but I'm going to let you know what's happening now. So now going deeper onto these headlines, essentially, President Trump has announced this expansion, this new pipeline between Canada and U.S. It's not the Keystone XL pipeline coming back exactly. It's a modified version. So if you're wondering, if you remember the Keystone XL pipeline, well, let's go back a few years and I can remind you what that was about. So essentially, back in 2021, Alberta spent $1.5 billion investing in the Keystone XL pipeline. That was back then with Premier Jason Kenney. It was widely seen as a high-risk political and financial gamble at the time, but essentially it was key to get Alberta oil, production increased to the United States. And what that happened with that was, Biden got into office in that election, and shortly after, Biden canceled that contract. He canceled the plans for this pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline. So essentially, the $1.5 billion that was invested by Alberta, essentially taxpayers' dollars, went a bust, pretty much. That's what happened. So why did Alberta decide to do that? Essentially, it was a time where it wanted to step up with the public money to support the project. And it was at a time, if you recall, it was the Trudeau era, which was anti-pipeline, and it had key investors back out of Canada when it came to like private companies supporting this pipeline, essentially investing and not public money. So this was a way, because of the private investors had hesitated and had essentially backed out, back then, Premier Jason Kenney decided to put up the money. So it was $1.5 billion in equity plus a $6 billion in loan guarantees. This actually went back to 2020. And this was canceled by President Joe Biden in 2021. And Alberta essentially lost that money that has put forward. And what you're seeing the picture of is President Trump, who's now signed for this new pipeline between Canada and the United States. So if you recall, it was under President Trump, his first administration, who approved Keystone XL pipeline. Then he loses the election for his second term, and Joe Biden gets in, and Joe Biden cancels the entire thing. Essentially, the valuation on that was supposed to be a potential about $30 billion in long-term revenues. That was what the government had estimated, which that's why it put up the money. And essentially the reason private investors, backed out on the Keystone XL pipeline was because it was over a decade of delays. There were legal battles. There were strong environmental oppositions, if you recall, during the Trudeau era. And so this was a time where immediately everything was switched off, regardless of the investment that Alberta had put in. It was essentially announced on Joe Biden's first day. Before he even took office, he just announced it, and it just killed everything on the spot. So now what we're talking about today, as President Trump has now signed in order for this new project, it's got a new name. It's called Bridger Pipeline Expansion. Essentially, this is going to be the existing Keystone XL infrastructure in Canada. And the new route will be through Montana and Wyoming in the United States. So in terms of the, some numbers around what this means for, Canadian oil output, essentially the length will be 1,050 kilometers. That's about 650 miles. The path will go from Canada, Alberta to Montana to Wyoming. And this will connect to the U.S. pipeline network. Essentially, Canada, the U.S. is already Canada's number one customer for Canadian oil. It takes about 90% of Canadian oil. So the capacity for this new pipeline will be 450,000 to 550,000 barrels per day. So that's about 2/3 of the size of the original Keystone XL, and this could boost estimated about 12% increase in Canadian oil exports to the United States. Now, construction is to start in 2027 and complete by 2029. This is still very early stages. It was announced yesterday, and it still needs to go through state approvals, environmental reviews, and of course the legal clearance. But it shows that the willingness is there from President Trump's administration, as well as from Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith, who's very ecstatic about this. It creates jobs, obviously, in Alberta, and it's a great big boost to the economy in Alberta, and of course Canada. So currently, Canada exports 4.4 million barrels a day to the United States. So this will be essentially more of an economic hard power on Canada's side. And we know that this President Trump, has always been pro pipeline, and he's pushing for fast tracking permits, which is very good news for Canada. This is coming before the renegotiations on CUSMA that is scheduled for July 1st. So this is big news before that. So it'll be very interesting to see how this will play into the greater CUSMA negotiations on some of the other key things. Well, if we want to take a look at what could potentially pop up again, if we want to take a look at what happened with the Keystone XL pipeline, well, essentially the delays were because of the environmental lawsuits and Indigenous tribes' opposition to it. So this is something that will have to be looked at and reworked. And of course, those key stakeholders need to be taken into account to make sure this new pipeline, has its launch date, which is supposed to start construction in 2027. There are some infrastructure gaps. Essentially, Wyoming is not a refining hub, so it means more pipelines need to reach, that Gulf Coast, needing major refineries. So there's that infrastructure challenge that needs to be addressed, of course. And of course, there's also the political risk, right? So projects that span multiple years could have these challenges come up. But and in the case of what happened last time, where Joe Biden came in after President Trump and canceled the pipeline. So this is another thing that, it's supposed to be completed by 2029, but that also leads us well into another administration. Trump has already served almost a year and a half, you could say, shy of a year and a half by, just a couple of months of his term. And we know that in about a year and a half time period, we're going to be going into what would be the United States having, their debates and an election cycle when they have the next Republican candidate to be the president. So we know that it's fast approaching. Time is flying by really fast. So what are the economic upsides? Essentially, it is more jobs in Alberta. It's going to be more provincial revenues. This will be a leverage for the Canada-US trade deal that is supposed to take place. And of course, it's at a time where we need global oil pricing stability, and Canada's output is definitely really great news. But of course, we need to take into consideration climate policies that are in conflict, and of course, the ESG investor pressures that are in place. So what this means is, Canada will be the supplier, and US is a buyer, and it is a secure partner. Obviously, we're talking about pipelines, and once when they go in, it's very hard to undo that, of course. So this is a strength on the Canada side. We've seen that Canada military is top of mind for this Carney government. And so the latest numbers is that Canada is ramping up its efforts to fix its military recruitment and prepare for a larger scale mobilization as global tensions arise with these wars that, have been going on, whether it's the Ukraine-Russia war and, for the past 2 months, the US, Israel, and Iran war. So essentially, defense demands are growing. And of course, there's the Arctic defense strategy that this government has been talking about. So now the government's looking at how to recruit more personnel, speed up training. And what you're seeing a video is from the armed forces, essentially it's their recruitment video to be able to take in new recruits and go through the basic training program. And that's a video from the Canadian Armed Forces. So essentially what this government wants to do is they're looking at recruitment for personnel to speed up training, build capacity for potential rapid expansion of forces into these crisis situations, right? So Canada is preparing, but not just for recruitment, but to scale its military quickly. The latest numbers are last year recruited 7,300 new recruits. It's still falling short on a target. Essentially, there's 67,800 new recruits, and in terms of the force target versus the 71,500 target. So it's still off by a few thousand. And essentially, right now, when it comes to exploring its expansion of reserves towards 100,000 in extreme scenarios. So we're seeing some of these staggered numbers. We know that Canada's finally reached its 2% of GDP for the NATO target. The government has announced 125,000 jobs in the defense sector, within the next few years, up to 10 years is their target. So essentially, the core problem isn't just the recruitment, but it's also training, housing, deployment of troops fast enough. So right now, Canada's military is at 100,000 total personnel that's active and reserves. And this is because, there's NATO expectations, the global conflicts we talked about, and a need for domestic and international readiness, which we're seeing in the Arctic defense strategy is one of them. So this is a time where, Canada, can recruit, but it needs to expand rapidly when it comes to these structural changes and to make sure that training happens and gets them out the door. So if you're looking at, potential careers of where Canada's investing, you have the defense sector, such as the targets are still below, so the applications are open. And then, of course, what we're seeing in the skills trade, where Canada just, the new government announced, about $6 billion for 100,000 trade skills workers. So, that's where things are at right now in terms of backed programs. And in other news, very interesting, is that Canada is facing a growing political pressure over its role on supplying weapons that ultimately flow throughout to the United States. And it's raising concerns and questions about accountability and oversight. So if you're wondering, what is this about? We've always heard about the number of weapons that go from Canada across the board to the United States. We know that President Trump made an issue of this last year when he wanted Canada to put more efforts, about $2 billion at the border, which was for what he said was weapons, illegal migrants, as well as fentanyl. So here's the actual issue. Seems to be a loophole that has come to attention, which is the Canadian military exports to the United States. That export is often exempt from the strict export permits and the human rights reviews that Canada has in place. So essentially what it means is Ottawa may have, limited visibility in the end in terms of where those weapons end up in the long term. So it processes can send the weapons across the border, but what happens in terms of how the United States uses it is something that Canada does not have any clarity on. And this is an actual issue because Canada's in this indirect supplying conflict, and it could be a conflict anywhere without knowing, if it's their weapons and without having full control or transparency. So Canada's export defense goods to the United States under what would be a special exemption. And these exports often, they don't require a case-by-case permit, which is, it's to know about this. It's actually, quite very serious. So these exports will not go through case-by-case permits, and they'll also skip what would be a detailed human risk assessment. So why would that be the case? Why is that allowed? Well, essentially, aside from Canadian energy being highly integrated into, the United States with pipelines from Alberta to the United States for refineries, and we talked about the expansion of that, more barrels per day. It also happens when it comes to the defense industry. So there's a very integrated system. Of course, we saw that with the auto sector, but now when it comes to defense, it's an integrated defense system. between the two countries, and of course for NATO cooperation. And this is the case for faster supply chains, is why it's been put up. So essentially, once the weapon from the Canadian side is inside the United States system, and these would be Canadian parts and components, whether it's to build weapon systems or if it's combined with U.S. technology, like we've seen with the auto industry, where a part could cross the border between Canada and the United States many times before a final car is made, a final vehicle is made. But this is also the case when it comes to this defense parts and components industry. And essentially, those systems are then when they're put together in the United States, they could be sold abroad or be used in military operations. So Canada is losing visibility and control over its components and parts. And so now critics are saying that the Canadian components can be integrated into U.S. weapon systems and then exported or used in conflict without Canadian oversight. And there was a recent bill was put forward in Parliament to tighten the oversight, and it was rejected in Parliament. So nothing is going to change. In terms of some of the stats and figures to understand like the gravity of this, means about 70% of Canada's defense procurement comes from the United States. So essentially, Canada's exports billions annually in defense-related goods. That's Canada exports billions annually to the United States when it comes to aerospace parts, electronics, armored vehicle components, and the United States approves about $2.6 billion in weapon-related sale to Canada. So you can see, there's a sale of weapons, $2.6 billion to Canada from the United States. And then Canada is sending parts and components for aerospace parts, electronics, armored vehicles, and weapons. So this means that the two countries are deeply integrated in their defense supply chain, which is, of course, going to be, we have this CUSMA review that's taking place, but now we're seeing that this is a massive component of that. And then we have the energy corridor that is also a component. So these are all things that are coming to terms in terms of, what is this relationship between the United States and Canada? And in a situation where the relationship is not as friendly as we've seen in the past year with President Trump, then what does it mean for Canada, its economic security, as well as some of these other factors? So now this is attention. I guess that's why it was, strike down in Parliament when, stricter measures were proposed, essentially seeing that there's economic and security ties between the two countries. But then there's that aspect of human rights accountability and foreign policy that Canada doesn't have any oversight on, or really any transparency. And so the critics have, essentially said, based on this issue, Canada should have stricter export rules. And, but in this case, you have U.S. exemptions would undermine that, because then essentially the U.S. can do its own exports and Canada will not be part of that, conversation. So Canadian-made components could end up in conflict zones. It could end up in countries with poor human rights records. And this is without Canada's approval or transparency of knowing it. So this is, this is serious, because when it comes to legal policy, right, and this is a massive contradiction, Canada has committed to the Arms Trade Treaty principles, the human rights-based export controls, but this loophole to send it to the United States, and the United States sends it to wherever it deems necessary, creates this loophole where Canada is essentially, there's the contradiction to those legal policies that Canada abides by in the first place. So it's very interesting. And coming back to Ymedia Newsroom, essentially China has drawn the red lines for Canada when it comes to Taiwan. This is a very big deal. We know this Prime Minister has restarted the relationship with China and, a trade agreement between the two countries. And to this, China has essentially put the red line when it comes to Taiwan. A Chinese envoy has warned Canada against sending members of parliament to Taiwan and sending warships towards Taiwan Strait. So this is very critical. This isn't a new language, of course, right? But the timing is very important. It is happening during this heightened global tension that we're seeing in military positioning. We have current wars taking place, and we know that China has always said that Taiwan is under the one China policy, right? So this is a position that China has, and and they say that it's simple and it's non-negotiable. It is a red line not to be crossed. Essentially, China says that Taiwan is part of China, that it's not a sovereign country on its own, and any foreign political or military engagement would equal interference in that issue that Taiwan is part of China. So this is tied to the policy of one China policy, which Canada formally has acknowledged, while still maintaining informal ties with Taiwan. We know that there's been trade is a massive thing between when it comes to technology and parts between Taiwan and Canada. So we know that is a critical thing. But this tension, is very important because Canada and its allies transit the Taiwan Strait, the waterway around Taiwan, to assert their international, waters in terms of what they say is support for navigation, right? So the Strait of Taiwan carries 20% of global maritime trade. And Canada has conducted multiple naval transits since 2018. And since then, it's increased its Indo-Pacific presence by up to 3 warships a year. Now, China is seeing this as essentially military signaling and not a neutral transit. So that's why it's drawing the red line for Canada. So when it comes to China, essentially, they see that any political visits from members of parliament, any elected officials from Canada's side to Taiwan is essentially a recognition of Taiwan's, sovereignty, autonomy, which is what they view it as. Because if you're sending elected officials, whether they're on unofficial visits, it's viewed as legitimizing Taiwan as separate from China, right? So that's a very critical point for China's one China policy. And this is why now Beijing is reacting very strongly every time that there is an MP that goes from Canada to Taiwan. So this is a warning, which is, essentially at a time where we're seeing the global tensions rising. The Taiwan Strait already has a military flashpoint for China, and because the Chinese naval and air activities are increasing. So that's another critical thing that's taking place at this time. And then now you have, with the Strait of Hormuz closed and Iran essentially asserting themselves to have authority on 20% of oil exports from the Strait of Hormuz. This is then at the same time when you have Russia invading Ukraine. This is also sending signals of China waiting and seeing what is the appetite in the world and what is happening. And so it's definitely stepping up when it comes its Chinese naval and air activity. So now Canada is very active actually in the Indo-Pacific. It's got more naval presence. It's got closer alignment with US and its allies, right? So China is now pushing back by saying, hey, there's a warning before any actions happen, such as MPs going over to Taiwan or sending more of your vessels through the Taiwan Strait. They're saying that, here's a message. We want to deter it before it escalates, right? So now if Canada proceeds, so let's look at the scenarios, right? If it proceeds with visits and transits through the Strait of Taiwan, this will going to have, of course, a diplomatic backlash from China. And this is the time where the prime minister wants to engage China and get on good footing with China, right, for trade. And so this is going to be, obviously, if this happens, there'll be trade frictions, there'll be a diplomatic freeze, and there'll be a military showdown at sea, which we do not want to see. We've already seen much of that in the last few weeks when it comes to the Gulf countries and the Strait of Hormuz. So definitely in the Gulf of Oman, what we've seen happen there with US military vessels and Iran. So this is something, obviously, we don't want to see an escalation on the Strait of Taiwan. Another scenario is now if Canada sees that this is a red line and it holds back, it has another situation to deal with when it comes to our foreign affairs minister, Anita Anand, in terms of, and obviously the defense minister, which is, if Canada holds back in terms of its warning from China and has less presence in the Strait of Taiwan, then it looks like a weakened stance with its allies, such as the United States, and it's giving into the Chinese pressure. So that's a critical point. So if it's very this diplomatic situation has to be tread very carefully. And then there's, of course, Canada balancing its economic ties with China, and of course its security alignment with the Western allies for Taiwan. So this is very critical. And so now whether Canada leans more towards China, which the U.S. has essentially been pushing back on, if you recall, with President Trump saying that there are going to be tariffs and they don't want Canada to be a backdoor for Chinese goods into the United States. And we know that when it comes to U.S.-led Indo-Pacific strategy, it requires Canada to be present as an ally. So China's making it clear that Taiwan is the line you do not want to cross. Based on the U.S., Israel, and Iran war updates, essentially there's multiple developments taking place, and it shows that this conflict is entering into what would be a mixed phase of diplomacy, perhaps, and continued pressure from all sides. Iran has submitted a new proposal to the United States via Pakistan in terms of what is in that new proposal. We're going to know fairly soon when both sides release it. But right now it's between the two countries via Pakistan. And essentially Tehran has said that they're open to talks and, and at the same time ready to resume the war, which we're hearing from both sides. So that is the escalation point in terms of the pressure that they're all putting on each other. And, because when we look at the regional tensions, right, you have Israel Israel and Lebanon are supposed to be also in a ceasefire for, 3 weeks period. And yet the strikes are continuing between the two nations. We know the two nations, their ambassadors have had, multiple rounds of talks, well, two to be exact, in Washington, D.C., to bring the two countries at the table. There was supposed to be a ceasefire that President Trump announced that he's going to make sure holds, but we know that strikes are taking place between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, so that is continuing. You have the maritime tensions that are rising in the Strait of Hormuz with the U.S. blockade that's taking place of the Iranian ports. We know that in response, Iran seized two vessels of private cargo. So we're seeing there's pressure on all sides. We know that there was a previous statement put forward that Iran saying open up the ports, allow us to trade, and then we'll come to the table on nuclear weapons, and of course the whole issue on what the U.S. had asked for in terms of zero enrichment of uranium, not even for civilian purposes, for 20 years. And then the U.S. saying, no, come to the table first on the nuclear program, and then we will release, our vessels against the Iranian ports. So there's that sort of a standoff. This now new proposal, it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And then, of course, you have this active talks on multiple fronts, right? So now Iran has submitted a new proposal through Pakistan and says negotiations never stopped. Up to two countries have always, there's been a channel. That's what Iran is saying right now, and essentially saying that it won't accept any imposed terms, that it needs to come to the table without essentially being under duress to agree to the nuclear program. Because there is U.S. vessels blockading Iranian ports and not allowing trade to take place. And then there is the challenge of essentially, what we're seeing in the United States front, which is now this war that President Trump went into starting on February 28th. He went to war without asking permission from Congress. And then there is a limit of about 60 days that if you're in a war that you have to go to Congress and get approval. And then there's that 30-day limit that starts happening. And now President Trump is saying, no, there's been a ceasefire since April 7th. And so therefore, he does not need to move to Congress for approval. The 60-day mark is, it's today. essentially. So there's a potential constitutional fight that's brewing in Washington, D.C. Congress is essentially divided on this factor. And then there's the Lebanon front. There's the ongoing Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon. And to that, the Lebanese prime minister is engaging U.S. diplomatically on this matter and essentially asking for aid to stop this war effort that's taking place because they're supposed to be in a ceasefire. And then there's the Strait of Hormuz tensions. And to this, UAE has now made a few very bold moves. As of today, May 1st, UAE has left OPEC after being in OPEC for 50 years. Essentially, OPEC was, limit in terms of production, pricing, and output. And now with UAE leaving OPEC, essentially, it says it wants to produce as much oil as it wants to, it wants to export as much as it wants to, and price it. And now UAE is actually being very open, and they've actually said that that Iran's control of the shipping in the Strait of Hormuz cannot be trusted. Essentially, showing regional distrust. And that's another very bold move on the UAE side. And then you flashpoint to what's happening in this multi-regional conflict, and you have the Gaza issue where Israeli forces are seizing aid and flotilla near Greece, which has now been it's in the news. There's about 100 plus activists that have been detained. And so that's expanding the conflict in the Mediterranean tension. And then you have the dual track conflict, right? There's diplomacy behind the scenes as per Iran and as per what President Trump has said a few times. And then there's escalation on the ground and more specifically at sea. And so there's a few risk factors. On the one front, it's, Lebanon with Hezbollah and Israel, and then Gaza issue. And then that could derail the negotiations. But, this latest proposal, it's showing that it's a signal, perhaps, to less from confrontation escalation and more towards negotiation positioning between the two countries. Essentially, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi has been engaging in diplomatic talks. We know that today he's made calls to his counterparts in Turkey, in Iraq, Azerbaijan, Egypt, and he's saying that he's conveying their messages to Pakistan as well, who is the mediator here between the two countries, United States and Iran. Now, the official announcement from, they're saying that there should be official announcements coming from Iran's Foreign Affairs Ministry, their spokesperson, Esmail Baghai, or the Foreign Affairs Minister, Araghchi. They're saying unless that's made, there needs to be direct. And from that, the spokesperson, Baghai, has said that if there's any news about negotiations taking place in terms of this new offer deal, it'll be announced through Iran's official platform. So that's something that they've said. And to that, we know that Pete Hegseth is going through his review with Congress right now, answering questions about this war. And so we had the Foreign Affairs Ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghai. He went to X and he put up a statement saying, and this is in response to what is playing out in U.S. media. He's saying that self-defense wasn't what, and we have his post. We can post that there. So Esmail Baghai has said that self-defense against what, right? Saying that if there are any armed attacks to Iran to justify self-defense, definitely not. So this is absolutely not a self-defense. It was an act of aggression against the nation of Iran. Essentially, you see that he's plugged out a clip of what would be Operation Epic Fury and international law, which is what the United States had called this mission in Iran on February 28th that assassinated Ayatollah Khamenei and high-ranking officials in the Iranian regime. Essentially, this flashpoint, it says Iran and the United States have explained in multiple letters to the UN Security Council, including most recently on March 10th, the United States is engaged in this conflict at the request of and in the collective self-defense of Israeli ally, as well as in the exercise of the United States' own inherent right of self-defense. This is why the response of the spokesperson, Bakai of Foreign Affairs Ministry of Iran, says self-defense against what, right? He's responding to Operation Epic Fury's statement and essentially saying, I'll read that again, was there any armed attacks by Iran to justify self-defense? Definitely not. So this was absolutely not self-defense. It was an act of aggression against the nation of Iran. So you're seeing the posts that President Trump puts on Truth Social. You're seeing the posts from the Iran side that we just covered. And at the same time, we're hearing about new proposals put forward from Iran to the United States. So, of course, this is a changing and evolving situation. And when we know more about it, of course, we're going to let you know what was in this new proposal and what does it mean on this war that is now in a ceasefire, but the pressure is, of course, on many different fronts. But we're seeing a shift, right? We're seeing a shift that that was very different from March, right? So we're seeing that the U.S. is quietly lowering its urgency, right? Before it was, if President Trump's saying, it's going to be bridge and power plant day, threatening to destroy infrastructures, destroy, the civilization to never return, talking about Iran, and then Iran's retaliation points in terms of what it did to the GCC countries when it comes to the U.S. Army bases. But so now we're seeing a massive shift. We're seeing that the U.S. is quietly lowering its urgency on this war. And Pete Hegseth, who's been, going through the panel review with Congress, essentially he says that he did say, finally, he said there was no imminent nuclear threat. And that's not a random statement for Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense. So this also shows it's removing the main justification of continued escalation moving forward. And that Iran has also been showing restraint deliberately, right? Even though there has been no attacks on U.S. naval forces despite the blockade. So we know that it's been a couple of weeks now. There's blockades of the U.S. naval forces on Iranian ports. Iran has not retaliated or attacked them. There's been no aggressive escalations in response to what's happening in Israel's actions in Lebanon, because that was one of the key sticking points of, if you recall, right after the ceasefire on April 7th, that Israel should also have a ceasefire in Lebanon. So now it's also not reacting to that. So those are very critical shifts that we've seen in these past few weeks. And so this is signaling what would be, they don't want to escalate it. They don't want this to spiral and this conflict, right? So both sides are testing limits, but not crossing that red line to go back into massive war again, right? The limits being tested on the U.S. side is the U.S. naval blockade. Iran is rerouting through Pakistan as an alternative route, since its ports are blocked by the U.S. And then we're seeing that Israel's doing what it wants to do, and there seems to be no pressure from either the United States as well as Iran on what's happening in Lebanon. It's devastating, but this is what we're seeing. It seems like it's a more controlled tension, and each other essentially seeing how far they can push it, right? Israel doing its military operation and occupation in southern Lebanon and seeing how far is it going to be able to push it. And then, of course, it's offensive with Hezbollah and vice versa. And is Iran going to react? So this is a shift that, of course, we've noticed as taking place. And to that, I want to show you a picture that just recently you have. It is from the U.S. Central Command. They put a post and they put pictures. We have that. And you can see there that it says that it's replenishing its guided missile destroyer to this. So you could see a crate coming down of fuel, food, munitions, which is weapons and essential supplies. And that is to the U.S. Navy ships. Essentially, the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination has said that the proposed Israeli legislation introducing the death penalty for certain attacks could discriminate against Palestinians and weaken human rights protection. This has made headlines for quite some time, and there's been a lot of response, and now the UN has stepped in. Essentially, the committee argues that the law that Israel has put forward would effectively apply only to Palestinians, raising concerns about unequal application and rollback of what would be a long-standing limit on capital punishment in Israel. Essentially, the United Nations is warning that this law, this new law that Israel has put forward, could reintroduce executions and deepen legal inequality between Israelis as well as Palestinians. So what are some of the key facts here? Israel has a de facto moratorium on executions since 1962. So this new proposed law essentially targets deadly attacks tied to intent against the state of Israel. And critics say that the wording makes it primarily applicable to Palestinians. So even though it's not directly, the law is not directly saying Palestinians, this applies to Palestinians, but because it says that it targets deadly attacks tied to intent against the state. And this is why the UN position is that it's calling it as a severe blow to human rights efforts, and it's urging a repeal and an end to what would be, in this case, this new law, a discriminatory practice from Israel's side against Palestinians. So why, has this raised concerns? Essentially, this is challenging equality and equal application of law, right? So based on ethnicity in that sense, and expansion of capital punishment, which is quite severe. So there you have the likely increase of what would be an international scrutiny, which we've seen take place in recent weeks against Israel, and as well as illegal and political pressure on Israel, which we're seeing take place, right now with what's happening in southern Lebanon and Gaza for the last few years, the West Bank. And to that point, Italy has ended its defense agreement with Israel. So, and then we know that just a couple of weeks ago, the European Union proposed to ending its trade agreement with Israel, which was struck down. But that proposal was put in motion by Ireland as well. And we know Spain has been very open about some of these things that are taking place. So that's definitely been making some headlines. Now, in business news, essentially Polymarkets is rolling out its new surveillance tool to detect insider trading. Essentially, Polymarkets is a platform for prediction market, is what they call it. And this is where people will trade on what they believe will be future events across, various different items, whether it's, based on the war, whether it's election based or sports betting. All of that essentially takes place on the Poly market for a prediction market, right? To place bets and trading. So essentially now Polymarket is responding to what they're suspecting would be insider trading because of this one major scandal that took place in the United States, where it involved a US soldier essentially using classified military information to profit from the bets on Polymarket. So what happened was, because of that, essentially this platform, Polymarkets, is going to flag suspicious trades and track patterns that suggest there might be insider knowledge taking place, because this is a betting for future events, right? This is what Polymarkets does, and then share that evidence with law enforcement to really, to really have this in place so there's no insider trading. So this is marking a shift from what was, open betting to a more regulated, monitored market behavior because of the levels of trade that are taking place. So now, why did this get triggered? Well, essentially, a U.S. soldier allegedly made $400,000 in profits betting on the removal of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. Okay, the activity was based on a $33,000 bet placed using insider knowledge, and then the profit was $400,000. And the charges that are now being placed on this U.S. soldier is essentially charges of wire fraud, misuse of classified information, and potential decades in prison once he goes to court and found guilty, essentially saying that he had insider knowledge of what was going to take place in Venezuela and put a bet against it, and therefore was able to profit. And then shortly after, we saw what happened in Venezuela with Maduro. So now the platform is responding by saying it's going to cooperate more with investigators. It's going to have, it's going to build automated detection systems in place to be able to detect this, because this situation with this U.S. soldier was the first major trading case tied to, this prediction market. And it's expanding its enforcement beyond what would be stocks to now what we're seeing in geopolitical for this one specific event, and to war betting. If you go onto Polymarkets right now, you'll see, what they think is going to happen in the US, Israel, Iran war. All of that is up for bets. So essentially it's raised an issue where people with real power can profit, with events that they essentially influence. This has been a case that we've heard about from, members in Congress for a very long time. And now we're, looking at this scenario as, insider trading. And when it comes to another social media platform that everyone is aware of, it's Instagram. It's now cracking down on content aggregators. Well, essentially, it's saying that it wants to limit how widely their posts will be. This is to make sure that they're able to only repost original content, because we've seen this trend take place on Instagram lately, where you have Instagram profiles reposting content and then essentially putting their reaction to someone else's original content, right? So Instagram is now saying that they want to be able to limit that, change this target to essentially, that targets accounts that essentially repost viral content so they can get hits and views and traction, and by essentially sharing screenshots, clips without any meaningful edits, without adding any meaningful contribution to the original content. And what it wants to do is it wants to essentially promote that original content instead of what would be just reposting, right? So, and what this will do is essentially those accounts that just repost without any meaningful contribution to the original content creator will lose reach in recommendations. When it comes to explore, suggested feeds, they'll still be visible to their followers. So if it's an account that has followers that, frequently just reposts other people's, original content without contributing to it, their followers will still see their posts, but it will not reach people that do not follow them and perhaps would come across their content through feeds and whatnot. So original content is now defined as content you create yourself, right? Or materially edit contents by adding value or unique perspective. So for example, there is a content creator who puts their opinion forward on some issue, and then another content creator takes that and then shows it and then responds to it, and it can offer some value in that perspective or an opposing perspective, for example. So this will not be promoted in the algorithm, is what Instagram has now announced. And we know before with AI content, and we also know that the algorithm also on YouTube will not promote any AI images or content that is all based on AI and not by a human being. Because if that was the case, then you can imagine how much content would be uploaded on YouTube that is an AI generated video, AI generated voice. And this is something that YouTube also doesn't do. It wants to have real humans creating content and human input, right? So this is critical changes that we're seeing take place. And what we're going to see is, because recently we saw viral reposts, right? So original content would go viral, and then you have other content creators, other accounts that would just jump on the bandwagon and just repost. So now there's going to be, slow growth in terms of that. And when it comes to original creators, there'll be more visibility and distribution, which is what the aim of Instagram is. And Instagram, we know that has approximately 2.99, so about 3 billion monthly active users globally, making it one of the world's most popular social media platforms. The users are, predominantly young people, and with 60% are aged between 18 to 34. And believe it or not, the largest audiences of Instagram are based in India and the United States. In India, it's about 230 million subscribers in terms of getting onto the platform. In the United States, it's about 172 million users that get on that platform. So it's widely used, and therefore Instagram is setting up new rules. That's all the time I have. I'll jump back to Arvind G for any of his updates. Until next week, take care and be well.